Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think I'll get started. So I'm Professor Bryony Dow. I'm the Director of the National Ageing Research Institute. And I'd like to start our seminar today by acknowledging that Ngari is on the country of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and which we're all meeting from across different parts of Australia. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including members of the Stolen Generations. And I'd also like to pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who might be joining us today. So just to remind everyone that you're being recorded. I know you've just agreed to that, but just to keep in mind, if you would prefer not to have your face or recorded, keep your camera off, and generally keep your camera and audio off unless you wanted to ask a question at the end. So this is our last seminar for 2022, and as such we have a very special seminar today. I'm very excited to note that we have 3 researchers from different discipline backgrounds and different countries of the world, but collectively their research draws attention to the limits and ethics of autonomy and choice in older people who require assistance with everyday personal care, particularly transgressive personal care or intimate personal care that transgresses normal personal boundaries. So they're going to present findings from their individual programs of research that illuminate cultures of care in institutional care settings that privilege practices of containment, restriction and restraint, and that inadvertently undermine the autonomy of older people who are care dependent. So that using continence care as an exemplar, they will argue for an ethic of care that recognises the reciprocity inherent in caregiving relationships and reframing the concept of autonomy to accommodate the needs and dependency of the care-dependent individual and, most importantly, uphold their dignity. So it gives me great pleasure to firstly introduce my colleague, Professor Joan Ostashkiewicz. Joan is a Principal Research Fellow and Director of Aged Care here at the National Ageing Research Institute. Joan oversees a program of research focusing on ageing and aged care, including continence caregiving, dementia caregiving, social support, quality of care and aged care system support and evaluation. And during this seminar, Joan will be presenting on building a new vision for care in residential aged care homes. I'm going to introduce all 3 speakers, but Joan will speak first. And then we'll hear from Professor Katie Featherston. And Katie's a Professor of Sociology and Medicine and Director of the Jella Institute of Ageing and Memory at the University of West London. Her research examines institutional cultures of care, drawing on traditions in ethnography and medical sociology. During this seminar, Katie will be presenting on PAD cultures and their consequences, a hospital ethnography of continence care for people living with dementia. And then finally, we have Dr. Tina Vatanen. Sorry, Tina, I hope I'm getting your name right. And Tina's a university researcher in Tampere University in Finland, and she's a transdisciplinary social scientist and ethnographer whose work focuses on social justice and political economies of health and social care and their complex local and global entanglements. She has developed an ethics of needs as an extension of the feminist ethic of care, with a particular interest in corporeal ethics, politics and economics of dementia care. During this seminar, Tina will be presenting on relational autonomies and embodied choreographies, rethinking the concept autonomy through intimate dementia care. So really looking forward to this fascinating seminar, and I hand over now to Joan to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Bryony, and thank you to everyone, my colleagues who've helped us put this together. We've been working on this for some time, and I'm absolutely delighted to be doing this with my international colleagues. So if you bear with me while I share my screen, and I'm known for not being brilliant at this. So I'm going to rely on you to tell me if I've got it right. Jess, what is it?
So you need to switch it around, Jo.
Yeah. Okay. Display settings, swap.
Looks good.
Okay. So we chose this really meaty title called The Limits and Ethics of Autonomy and Choice in Older People Who Are Care Dependent. We thought this was a particularly salient topic for this contemporary times because there have been so many so much illumination about the poor quality of care and infringements of the rights of many older people, and particularly people who are care dependent in residential aged care homes. And that's certainly a global problem that we identify and has received a lot of attention. And so as we're moving here in Australia to new aged care reform, which is underpinned by autonomy and choice, we think that this topic is really important at this point in time. So I'm going to be talking and proposing a new vision for care in residential aged care homes that's based on the concept of relational autonomy. In 1991, the General Assembly for the United Nations released a document outlining what it called principles for older people, and it encourages governments to incorporate principles of independence, participation, care, self-fulfillment and dignity into their national programs wherever possible. And there was a multi-stakeholder meeting of the human rights of older people held in August this year, where the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights actually said this: across all spheres of everyday life, from access to housing, employment and healthcare, or the digital world, older people continue to be subject to ageism and age discrimination, or discrimination on the basis of other grounds as well, such as gender, disability, migrant, or economic status. So this is the reason why it's important that we have, we focus on this topic of choice and rights. And if I could share with you just a personal scenario, I think we've all got examples of where there has been discrimination on the basis of age. And, just last night, my mother-in-law was admitted to hospital with pulmonary embolism. And, at midnight, they rang to say, oh, we're not going to resuscitate her. And we advise, that she not be resuscitated, but this is our decision. And when I said, well, I don't think that's your decision, I think that's my mother-in-law's decision, they were quite emphatic that it was in fact their decision, and went away and came back with, well, she's old and, she doesn't have great quality of life. So, just a day, and really quite concerning examples of this in everyday life. So here at NARI, we've long advocated for the rights of older people, and particularly including the rights of older people who are cognitively impaired. We've argued that a rights-based approach privileges that person's choices, identifies their goals, values and preferences, and that those goals, values and preferences are central to their care and daily routines. And that includes their right to access appropriate information to help them to make informed choices about the care and services they receive, to inclusive, respectful and accessible care that embraces their culture, diversity, identity and life experiences, culturally safe aged care, as well as equitable access to aged care regardless of personal, social or economic circumstances. And finally, a rights-based approach ensures that the older person is safe to provide feedback or raise concerns about their care. So this is work that NARI has been progressing now for many, many years. However, in this presentation, I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb together with my colleagues, and we're going to invite some discussion about some of the limitations of policy that relies too heavily on what we call an individualistic interpretation of autonomy, and suggest that in doing so, that some individuals are in danger of being left behind, marginalised. So by the end of the presentation, I'm hoping that you'll be convinced of the need for a more contextual and nuanced approach to the concept that meets with the real-life reality of the complexities that people in clinical experience in aged care encounter. So current approaches to protecting the rights of older people, I argue, are legalistic, and as such, they're informed by justice-based ethics. And justice is concerned with equitable distribution of benefits and burdens to individuals in social institutions and how the rights of various individuals are realised. So our argument is that whilst these approaches, whilst they're designed to protect the rights of people who lack decision-making capacity, they actually offer inadequate guidance to frontline health and aged care workers who are trying to decide how and what basic day-to-day care they should deliver to people who lack decision-making capacity. And so I'm going to draw on two key publications to point out a couple of limitations of this individualistic interpretation of autonomy, and my colleagues are going to pick up on it more in depth. So these are the two publications, and the first limitation is that it's somewhat misguided because it promotes the idea that the individual is an autonomous agent, self-transparent to their individual beliefs and values, and self-interested in their strategic choices. And it tends to think of the generic patient in idealised circumstances, and we all know that it's not like that. It's a messy situation. And critics argue that this liberal picture is too abstract and fails to incorporate the social context. And we know that decision-making occurs in a social context. My mother-in-law is not, she wouldn't be making a decision on her own to decide to accept or reject life-sustaining interventions. She would do that together with my husband and the family, taking into account a whole range of factors. And of course, there are power dynamics at play, particularly in an institutional setting and when you're feeling unwell and vulnerable. And there are other values that might be important to the person that are not taken into account, such as values about one's role and obligations and responsibilities. Decision-making necessarily affects others and has consequences, and those things will come into play. And none of us are immune to others' concerns or opinions, so our decisions are affected by them. And of course, not everybody wants to be protected from the influence of the people we love. Indeed, there's an assumption about the person being in a contractual relationship as a consumer, divorced from social reality. So that's one of the critics of this approach or interpretation of autonomy. And the second is that it inadequately portrays the decision-making process. And we know decision-making is not only affected by the social context, but as I said, by illness and vulnerability. I know my decisions about, they're not always rational, and particularly if I'm in pain or sleep deprived or hungry. The point is that we're emotional creatures and emotions can inform and underpin many of our decisions. The third criticism in the literature is a concern about the potential for a capacity-centred approach to autonomy to inadvertently discriminate against people who don't have that capacity. And hence there would be drawing a discriminatory distinction between ableist and non-ableist individuals. And aligned with this is a concern about an ethnocentric bias in mainstream bioethics that doesn't accommodate ethnocentric or cultural values, such as family harmony, filial piety, and community obligations. And the final aspect relates to shortcomings in current practices, law, and policies. Although it's recognised that decision-making is a dynamic, ongoing process rather than an isolated, discrete event, the actual processes for determining decision-making capacity result in a binary outcome. You have decision-making capacity or you don't. And this is problematic when you're caring for people with fluctuating cognitive symptoms, or those who can be considered autonomous for some actions and not others. And the other problem here is that current guidelines state that a person's decision-making capacity is decision-specific, that we need to recognise they have capacity to make some decisions, not others. And in practice, this is problematic because particularly where people have, the majority of people have impaired decision-making. So, meaty topics here, which my colleagues will expand on. But the reason I'm interested in this topic is because as a registered nurse, with expertise in aged care and as an academic, if I trace it to a single moment, it's when I was doing my PhD. And I used grounded theory methods to try to understand the nature of conscious care, the factors that underpin the delivery of conscious care, what it looked like and why. And I came up with a basic social problem, which was characterised by three key features. One was that there was a highly regulated environment the staff worked in, and they interpret that in certain ways that sometimes was inadvertently caused over monitoring and intrusive, unethical behaviours. But also the environment was highly ethically challenging. And the third factor was that the staff were in a devalued role. And I want to pick up in particular on the ethically challenging role. But before I do so, it's worth mentioning that there are some unique challenges about providing conscious care in residential aged care homes. Obviously, we all know about the high workloads. And so when staff are working in a resource-constrained environment, they make pragmatic decisions about residents, and they prioritise residents according to a certain hierarchy of care needs. And so, and other researchers have pointed out that they're often in a moral dilemma. They have to make, they prioritise one resident's needs over another. They're burdened by an avalanche of paperwork, and they feel like they lack voice and status. But the one in particular that I want to pick up on is this need to balance the residents' autonomy with protecting them from harm. And this was really, and my colleagues will also have some stories about this, but my story was Margaret. Her name's not really Margaret, but during the day, Margaret sat in a chair, and when staff came near her, she would recoil. She didn't verbalise at all. She was dependent for all aspects of care, including moving, assistance with eating, assistance with continence. So she wasn't being assisted to the toilet. She was being managed with pads. And I did observations at night time, and at night time I observed that staff did regular routine conscious care rounds where they check almost every resident's conscious care pads. And so, you know, when they went into Margaret's room, Margaret was screaming. And so when staff came out, they said, oh, she just doesn't like it, having her pad changed. We're not killing her. So this scenario pointed to me really clearly, or I interpreted this not as abuse, but as a real dilemma for staff, because I was trying to understand the situation from staff's perspectives. So the dilemma for them was around, you know, protecting her from developing skin breakdown from her incontinence. But clearly in doing so, it was care that she didn't want. And one of the other things about conscious care, by the way, that's really interesting sociologically is that it's quite invisible. So, you know, you won't see staff providing conscious care. It occurs behind closed doors. So incontinence is hidden and the care that goes into it is hidden. Now, advanced care plannings are put forward as the solution to problems related to decision-making. But indeed, if we know what a person wants and if it's legally enshrined, then ideally we'll be able to deliver treatment and care that's consistent with goals, preferences and values. And ideally they will have already appointed an enduring power of attorney or medical treatment decision maker to help them with their decisions or to make decisions on their behalf. And there have been enormous advances in Victoria over recent years in legislation to try to tighten up and improve law to enable people to support people's decision making. And hence there's a decision making hierarchy, which is here on the right. But the problem in residential aged care, and perhaps in acute care, I'm not sure, but the problem is that very few advanced care plans are completed in residential aged care in Australia. So I think it's something as low as 25%, and of these, only 6% have a statutory advanced care directive outlining preferences for care, and 12% had a statutory advanced care planning directive appointing a substitute decision maker. So about 38% of residents have one or more advanced care directives. However, the rate of appointment substitute decision makers is as low as 16%. And this study also found that those advanced care plans that were available, in many cases, it had been documented by somebody other than the person themselves. So we can't actually then rely on advanced care plans to help us make decisions. And of course, individualistic interpretations of autonomy are limited. So there's been research to show what health and aged care staff actually do in the face of ethically challenging decisions in everyday practice. And it's quite variable, and it's largely dependent on their interpersonal skills. So in the presentations by my colleagues, you're going to hear the worst of it and the best of how health and aged care workers respond to ethical challenges to respect the patient's choice and autonomy, and concurrently protect them and themselves, by the way, from harm. And in the best case scenario, you'll see practices that operationalise choice and autonomy in a connected and a relational sense, which brings me to relational autonomy, because what the presentations will show is that there's a need for an approach to decision-making that is also informed by the concept of relational autonomy. And relational autonomy aims to maintain the essential aspects of autonomy, namely control over one's life, while at the same time incorporating insights into the socially embedded notion. And as such, it might provide a way forward and a new vision for residential aged care. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to my colleagues. And welcome Katie. Professor Katie Featherstone to the podium.
Hello, hi. Right, I'm going to see if I can share my screen, which is having some difficulties at the moment. Let's see if I can do this. It's funny, you think you've reached a point where online talks are simple, but no. Tina, I think I'm going to have to ask you to do my slides for me, if that's all right.
That's okay. I'm just gonna share them now. So this is your set here, and just give me a nod or say when you want me to change the slide.
Fantastic.
Does it show?
Yeah, do you want to make them big screen?
Yes. Does it show?
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. And straight on to the next one. Perfect. So yeah, so great to be here today. I'm going to take you to the bedside. Following up from Joan, looking at the bedside and practices of care. So just to give you a bit of a context of the area where I work in, which is the acute setting in the UK. And my work focuses on the care of people living with dementia. That's because they're one of the largest populations in our hospitals. They occupy between 25 and 50% of all hospital beds. So they're a really significant population, but they're a population who have some of the worst outcomes and experiences. These are people who are not there because of their dementia, they're there because they've got an additional acute condition, typically a really treatable condition like a fracture, an infection. So they should be treated in the acute setting, and they should also be going home. But this is where we find actually they have some of the really poor experiences and outcomes. So that population that we hope should be going home, about a quarter will die during their admission, and a further third will deteriorate during their admission to such an extent that they won't be able to return home, that actually they will need to be admitted to long-term care. So we've seen this pattern for a long time. And there's a whole body of inquiries and reports that tell us again and again about these poor outcomes and experiences of this population. But what that tells us is there's something deeply systemic about the inequalities that population experiences. So, Tina, on to the next slide, please. So what is it about the acute setting that is really contributing to these poor outcomes and experiences? Well, in terms of the UK NHS response, it's been very organisational level interventions, really focusing on new types of wards, outsourcing of skills to specialist teams, and also identification and awareness schemes, which really means putting a sticker over the bedside of someone which says dementia. But my response and my team's response has really been, well, what is it about, rather than just go straight to these larger scale interventions, what is it about everyday care? What is it about the organisation and delivery of care within wards and at the bedside that might be contributing and shaping these poor outcomes and experiences? Tina, next one, please. So what we focus is on one really important aspect of care, really ethically challenging work, as Joan has said, of continence care. This is intimate care work, which, as Joan said, is invisible, silence care work. And in the context of the resource-constrained settings of NHS and healthcare more generally, it's really considered low status, and as Joan has written about, dirty work and dirty labour. It also transgresses social norms about touch and causing distress, and that can happen regardless of whether a highly skilled healthcare professional doing that. Distress is often part of that experiences of intimate care. There's also a significant lack of research and evidence-based training or interventions to support and really understand what high quality care looks like. And really that's where I came across Joan's work. Really her work has that sense of that humanity and dignity and that relational work that is so vital for high quality care and continence care for people with dementia. And I really feel this really built on her expertise in her writing. Tina, next slide, please. So in response, I obtained funding from the Department of Health and Social Care in the UK, funding by NIHR, to carry out with my colleague Andy Northcott a detailed ethnography, really looking at ordinary, everyday continence care in acute wards. And we carried this work out over a year in acute wards across England and Wales, really spending time in acute wards, working, following staff, shadowing their everyday work across shifts, daytime, evening, across the pattern of work and timetables of work in the wards. Tina, thank you. So what did we find? Well, we found cultures of care that we term PAD cultures as an embedded practice across the wards that we observed in England and Wales. And by PAD cultures, we mean the routine use of continence pads in the care of people with dementia, regardless of their continence status, their mobility and independence. Tina? Now, the organisational rationales for that were that this was a really important precautionary strategy to support the person, ensuring containment of leaks and accidents, and to reduce risk to the person of getting up and walking to the bathroom and the risks of falls. Tina. But once a person is in this very large visible, you've seen the photos before, very large visible continence pads held in place often by large mesh pants, which also required that people couldn't wear their ordinary clothes or pajamas, they had to wear a hospital gown. So once someone is placed in that institutional gown with a very visible pad, this really altered staff perceptions of the person. And it meant that all the healthcare professionals attending that bedside saw the person as someone who was incontinent. Incontinence was assumed. And this had a further effect that really transformed the cultures within these wards of expecting the person not only to wear the pad, but also that they should use them. These individuals they had reduced access to the bathrooms and toilets, and they were expected to stay at the bedside, to remain in bed or at the bedside and use the pads. Thanks, Tina. This really transformed care practices and the cultures of care practices within these wards. Continence care became highly reduced to the checking and replacing of pads as part of the timetables of care. This was really detrimental to the functionality and independence of individuals across an admission. That important rehabilitation work of walking to the bathroom was denied them. Also, intimate continence care was so routinized in terms of changing and checking pads, that this intimate care was often carried out in silence, without adequate warning or clear explanation, with real assumptions that the person knows what the pad is, how they should use it, and why it needs changing. And this became a very timetabled feature of care, and very fast-paced often as well. Tina? And what we saw was a real looping effect, which goes back to the classic ethnographies around Goffman and the asylum. Looping effect where people living with dementia experience really high levels of distress when experiencing intimate continence care from quite a wide range of health professionals who they did not know. But this care was so routinized that any resistance to intimate care would often quickly be perceived as aggression or challenging behaviour. And I use those terms very, this is how they were spoken of in the wards, and I don't condone that kind of language. In turn, that could really see the person being seen as being more highly dependent, maybe seen as a later stage of their dementia. So it overshadowed the person. That distress could just be seen as a feature of their dementia rather than an expression of distress. So this use of pads and institutional gowns could lead to that reclassification of the person as highly dependent. And although this was a practice typically carried out in the care of people with dementia, it also, there was a lot of contagion. It could spread, these practices could spread to other older people within the wards as well, and create a sense that actually all patients within these wards were highly dependent and needed to remain at the bedside. Tina? This had impacts on the independence of the person. Walking to the toilet was no longer seen as a sign of independence and capacity, but a risk to be managed. And walking to the bathroom was classified by staff as a feature of wandering, and the patient would be returned to the bedside. And we saw these patterns again and again of a person attempting to leave the bedside because they wanted to reach the bathroom, only to be returned again and to be told to use the pad. These patterns again we get that looping where that would cause distress in the person, and staff would see that as a feature of their dementia rather than a desire to go to the bathroom and to retain independence and dignity. Tina. And I need to say here that staff described continence care as a heavy burden, but they also felt very trapped in these patterns of care. They all told us that they wanted to give high quality continence care, but felt very trapped by the organisational demands of the wards, but also the institutions. The timetables of care were so fast paced. Those feelings of falling behind were very present and caused a lot of anxiety and stress for staff. That feeling of falling behind was something that they felt meant they could not give the high quality continence care they wanted to. Also, at an institutional level, there was no indications that continence care was had any recognition by these institutions and organisations, and no recognition that this might be critical for care quality and outcomes for this patient group. Tina? So what are we doing with this? Well, we found that our findings really resonate with wards and with ward staff and hospitals. We're currently working with a couple of wards in South Wales who are really recognise that they want to change the way that they're delivering continence care to people with dementia, and we're currently co-producing interventions based on our findings to see if we can pilot some ways that we could shape ward care to support people with dementia to retain independence, but also to support ward staff to deliver the care they really want to deliver. Tina? We've also found that it's having a wider resonance as well. So we've written about this in our open access book, Wandering the Wards. You can download that for free from Amazon or Google Books. Our work featured in a File on 4 BBC documentary. And from that documentary, which again is open access, we've been inundated with families who tell us this happened to them, that their person living with dementia went into hospital continent and left the hospital with incontinence and was unable to return home. We also see this is actually something that we're being contacted about that has a wider resonance internationally. Tina, final slide, please. And so what are we doing with this as well? In that this interest has really grown. And last week I attended the all-party parliamentary group on continence care to present these findings. And we're hoping then to take that to ministers as well in the UK to make some change on that higher policy level. Thank you. Tina, end of slides. Thank you. Thanks, Tina.
Then should I just go next right away?
Yes, please, Tina, sorry.
Yes.
Over to you, Tina.
Yes, thank you. So change to my own slides. There we go. So hello, everybody. So my name is Tiina Vaittinen, and I'm a university researcher at Tampere University, Finland. And I'm a transdisciplinary social scientist and a care ethicist whose work primarily focuses on the ethics and political economy of care in the context of varying phenomena. In my present project, it's called the PAT project. I develop holistically sustainable continence care that would account not only for the needs of the people and the economy, but also for the needs of the planet and the environment. What we do in the present project is we seek to reduce the ecological burden of continence products by means of better continence care for everybody. Today's presentation, however, builds on some of my earlier work in feminist care ethics and dementia, and introduces or talks more about the concept of relational autonomy, which is actually quite new to me as well. The presentation in the end took the form of a short essay, which I wrote, and there are some images and some things in the slides, but if you like, you can just, go take a walk or make yourself a cup of coffee, do your laundry, whatever, while you listen, and you can simply ignore the slides as well if you like. Anyway, I'll begin with individual autonomy as a core concept in bioethics. Along with the principles of benevolence, non-maleficence, and justice, the respect for individual autonomy is one of the cornerstones of modern bioethics. It is also one of the cornerstones of liberal political ideology, of which modern bioethics cannot really be separated. The liberal or neoliberal understanding of individual autonomy builds upon a very particular kind of image of human nature, the so-called homo economicus, the economic man, who is an independent being, free from care needs and caregiving duties, always ready, capable, and adequately informed to make rational decisions about one's life and well-being. A person living with dementia, however, cannot fit this image. They can never be the kind of subject that liberal ideology defines as a subject. On one hand, we can argue that the liberal ideology of individual autonomy fails persons with dementia. On the other hand, however, persons with dementia also challenge the predominant political thinking as well as the medical ethics that builds upon liberal ideology. While the purely autonomous and independent individual is a caricature that really doesn't exist anywhere in the world, it remains a powerful image of human nature that underlines not only our political life, but also medical ethics. It shows particularly in legislation and in procedural instructions, where there may be various bureaucracies at place to ensure individual decision-making also in times of life when this is no longer possible due to illness or other end-of-life conditions. Sometimes this boils down to, or this kind of help with these bureaucracies may provide for people who cannot really properly make decisions anymore. Sometimes this help comes in too late, or it comes in really problematically, and perhaps particularly so in dementia care. There are various instances of policy and practice where there is too much expectation of individual autonomy from persons living with dementia. The intentions here may be good, to avoid paternalism and to protect the possibility of choice for the person in need of care. Yet the consequences may result in bad care or outright negligence. For instance, a fully care-dependent person may be expected to autonomously purchase care from the markets or claim care services individually when they're no longer really capable of doing so. They may be pushed to various rehabilitative and uncomfortable daily routines at the point of life, where they can no longer be rehabilitated, but where they should be made comfortable until the end of their lives. Overemphasis on autonomy at the point of life, where the care receiver can no longer perform autonomy, can lead to situations where family members, and sometimes quite old family members, must navigate the social and healthcare system on behalf of the person with dementia. Often, they must provide the care that the society fails to deliver. Not everyone, of course, has family members to step in when the society fails. Economic inequalities come at play here too. While some can purchase adequate care from the markets, others cannot. Similarly, the ideology of individual autonomy underlies the aging at home policies, also known as deinstitutionalization of care, where it is argued that for each person, the best place to grow old and die is one's own individualized home. The intention again here is really good, to move away from a world where persons with disabilities and frailties of aging are routinely closed into the settings of institutionalized care. However, the downside of the policy is that persons with dementia may now be abandoned to age at home, leading an individual life of their own, even at the point when they no longer can really recognize the home and do not feel safe there, and would really need a place in a round-the-clock nursing home. This is the reality for many in Finland, for instance. Caregivers, in all these contexts, there are health practitioners and professional caregivers and familial caregivers who negotiate situations of care and care dependency, seeking to provide the best care they can in political structures where doing so is made very difficult, if not impossible. They may seek to ensure autonomous decision-making until the very end of life, drawing lines to where this is no longer possible, and alternatives such as surrogate decision-making comes into play. Caregivers also navigate and reinvent conceptions of autonomy in their daily practices. They do this every day at their work. For instance, one of my previous studies was a care home ethnography where I observed situations of nurse-led conflict resolution in situations of transgressive intimate care with persons with dementia. And this was a really, really good care home where they had put a lot of work and effort to build good practices. Due to their cognitive condition, some residents in this care home would not understand what was done to them in situations of washing and continence care. They would refuse the care violently. Every day, the nurses risked being hit, kicked, scratched when providing care to these residents, whose violence derived from their condition and from their own fear of the situation. Yet the nurses provided the intimate care, caringly and often quite cunningly. What I observed in these situations was not really forced care, but skillful persuasion and negotiation, where the autonomy of the care recipient was respected, even when it was not about the kind of rational individual autonomy of informed decision-making. The nurses utilized multiple embodied tactics and choreographies by which they sought to step into the epistemic reality of the care recipient, seeking to understand how the care recipients themselves sense the situation in order to meet the person caringly in their own reality. Often the situation that began threateningly would end peacefully because the experienced nurses in dementia care respected the care recipient's reality and indeed their autonomy to operate and react in their own reality, even when the reaction was aggressive. Here, the autonomy of the caregiver and care receiver were not separate from one another. Rather, their autonomies co-emerged with one another in particular situations and embodied encounters as these persons related with and responded to the requirements and happenstance of the situation. Importantly, the care receiver's autonomy would not disappear even when they were not capable of individual rational decisions or rational understanding of the situation. Rather, their autonomy became redefined in ways that accommodated the needs and dependency of the care-dependent individual, upholding their dignity. In these situations, I believe the nurses actually practiced relational autonomy, which challenges the traditional biomedical conceptions of individual autonomy. Relational autonomy is a concept that has emerged from the kind of critiques of liberal individual autonomy in bioethics that I have presented today. As noted by Carlos Gomez Verceta and his colleagues in a wonderful systematic review article, although the concept of relational autonomy has various philosophical roots, although lots of these roots come from feminist ethics of care. I'm not really able to summarize these rich traditions here, but it suffices to say that relational autonomy is a conception of autonomy that emphasizes human vulnerability and psychosocial connectiveness with others in the world. To cite these authors, relational autonomy aims to maintain the essential aspect of autonomy, namely control over one's life, while at the same time incorporating insights of the socially embedded notion of autonomy. Relational autonomy stresses situated ethical decision-making and the narrativity and historicity of human life. The concept of the self is not static, it's dynamic. This, the authors note, is of crucial importance for persons who live with dementia, because they can have their identity restored through a history shared with others. Care encounters, even when they are about seemingly routine practices of continence care, are actually about this very same history writing, where a person and their life can be made to feel recognized and identified as an autonomous being, also when they are fully care dependent. And then a few words to conclude. Critiques in different philosophical traditions and in feminist ethics of care in particular have for a very long time, actually for decades already, warned that an overemphasis on individualism can lead to really bad care because it disregards the relationality on which practices of care and our very survival depend. They argue that the liberal image of human nature as homo economicus is simply a fallacy. No human being ever is entirely autonomous and independent from others. This is because all humans are dependent on practices and relations of care from the moment of birth to death. This is a fact of human life, since without care, the human species would actually perish. none of us would survive as entirely individual autonomous beings. To replace the liberal moral theories, feminist care ethics has proposed alternative moral thinking that derives from relational and situated practices of care. To replace the ideal of Homo economicus, the economic man, they have suggested alternative and much more factual understanding of human nature, such as the image of homines curans from Joan Tronto, which means caring human beings, or Homo aegrotus. This comes from our Viva collective, which refers to ailing humans, or what I've termed the needy human being, Homo egenos. Because pure individual autonomy is a fallacy, perhaps so are bioethical rules based on autonomous decision-making that would apply under all circumstances with all individual care recipients unanimously. And this is because ethical thinking actually emerges and actually moral choices are made by real human beings in real life interaction, encounters, relations with one another. Health and social care practitioners know this as they practice relational autonomy in their everyday work. Yet they are simultaneously bound by bioethical and political ideals that emphasize individual rather than relational autonomy. And this creates a tension to the work of professional caregivers. There is then perhaps a need to rethink autonomy, and actually not only in dementia care, but in bioethics in general, and in the legislations and policies that define what is the right course of action in health and social care and in medical practice. In the context of dementia care, the principle of individual autonomy can at worst lead to the kind of emphasis on independent self-determination and rational choice-making that can no longer respect the subjectivity of the person living with dementia. The subject in dementia, after all, has lost some, if not most, of the cognitive capacities that allow for independent and rational choices over the kind of care that they need. And yet, persons with dementia have not lost their subjectivity and personhood altogether. They are still embodied subjects of their lives, but the subjectivity is of the kind that cannot be articulated in the form of liberal individualism. Lawrence Cohen has argued in their book, Thinking About Dementia, Cultural Loss and the Anthropology of Senility, that thinking about dementia is a necessary practice to address broader questions of language, of selfhood and sovereignty, and of the practices and forms of reason and life. They continue that there are multiple possibilities for rethinking what they call senility's reason, and abjection may not be the only mode of thinking about dementia. When it comes to the question of individual autonomy, perhaps we should not think about persons with dementia or other cognitive conditions as exceptions who cannot fully perform individual autonomy when making choices about their care. Perhaps no one can. Perhaps we should start generalizing bioethics from the condition of dementia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tina, Katie and Joan, for your fantastic collection of presentations. I think you've given us a very strong argument about how individualism and focusing on autonomy is not serving people living with dementia, and maybe not any of us, actually, Tina. Good point. Now, it looks like we've got, not long, but we've got a couple of minutes for questions. If anyone has a question they would like to ask, please either turn on your camera and mic or just put it in the chat. But I might kick off with a question of my own. As you were talking about how individualism fails people living with dementia, and the reasons for that, I was thinking another reason might be that it really isn't helpful for people living with dementia who come from cultural backgrounds that don't actually privilege individualism and autonomy to the same extent. And I was just wondering if any of you would like to comment on that observation.
Tina, perhaps you.
Perhaps Tina?
It's Joan.
Can you say it again, please? Sorry, I think the jet lag is kicking in. I'm feeling a bit disconcentrated. Yeah, please.
Okay, I was just saying that another way in which individualism and privileging of autonomy might fail people living with dementia is for those people who come from a culture where that's not privileged in the same way. And I was just interested in your thoughts about whether that's another failure, really. And we've got Bianca Bridgenorth might also want to comment on that.
Yeah, if somebody wants to comment on that from the audience as well. And I think Joan raised that in her presentation as well, that it's a very, very, I mean, modern bioethics and liberal individuals are very, very Western traditions of thinking what humanity is like. And I'm sure that it becomes like maybe a double barrier to access to services, really on a practical level, when it comes to people growing old in different cultural traditions, and also their carers and also their family members.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I just add to that as well?
Please do, Katie. Sorry, I'm just having trouble seeing the rest of the audience. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think there's something broader around any intersectional identity. Once you have continence or incontinence, and you have dementia, and you have aging, and you have any other identity or multiple identities as well, then absolutely that can have massive consequences for how you are seen and your opportunities. So yeah, so I think there's so much more to be done on those aspects of care for such a large number of populations. But I agree, I think that dementia, aging, continence really puts people in another position where they're really not able to access choice, autonomy, but all those other identities that might be also added on to that, then absolutely you get further and further away from having choice and opportunities, and it's seen very differently particularly in the acute context of care, that can very much other you and make you far more invisible as well to opportunities for high quality care.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And I noticed Bianca's put her camera on. Would you like to ask a question, Bianca, or make a comment?
Just a quick question to Katie, Joan and Tina, maybe about, sometimes when we all go to hospitals and we live in acute care, we kind of do a deal with ourselves that we sacrifice all elements of dignity and privacy while we're in that setting, but we know it's kind of spatially and temporally configured, right? This will not last forever. And I just wonder if that spatial temporal configurations have also featured in some of your work or thinking around how we approach the idea of dignity in continence care.
In terms of the length of time in those wards, and also well, I think there's something really interesting about the cultures of acute care, particularly when you look at the way care is organised and delivered. It really is, you could go into a 1950s asylum, and in America you can look at those ethnographies from then and you'd find actually that way care is organized and delivered is identical. Those practices of at the bedside, the pace, the timetables of care are identical. So I think there's something about our acute setting is designed for working age people and that's who they expect to have there. But they haven't caught up to actually that is no longer the person in our hospitals. That person is having day surgery and keyhole surgery and going home and never entering longer term stay. But it's still a sense that the person with dementia or older people don't belong. So there's something about that kind of cultural shift of how we see wards has got to change. But you're right, also it's a population that can be in hospital for a long time, so that opportunities to leave is less. So you're right, that deterioration can happen very suddenly, but then also very gradually during admission. So there's something particular about the population and the culture that is a mismatch, hasn't caught up yet.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, and all the issues that you're talking about, as Joan will tell you, we're experiencing in Australia as well. So it's an international issue. Tina, yeah, please.
Yeah, I don't know if we have time.
Noting that we are over time, but yes.
We're out of time.
Please,
okay, yeah.
We don't have you
let's
here
talk
for
about
long,
that later.
so please do contribute.
Sorry?
Oh, I was saying, please go. The people who
just a short, Bianca,
yeah.
I think that's an excellent, I think that's an excellent question. And I just wanted to briefly add about the very concept of relationality. It's often understood as a relation between and I was talking about it in that way as well, between the caregiver and the care receiver, but there are multiple relationalities entangled in that very moment of care encounters. There are temporalities, spatialities, the political structures, everything is in that happenstance, really. So, and I think that's also points to to some of the things that you referred to, Bianca, in terms of temporalities and spatialities, that they are always there, whether we kind of give up our dignity or not. And I think it raised what Katie was saying about the historicity of these very institutions. Yeah. Sorry to take more time.
No problem. No, I wish we had more time. I'm sure some of us would be happy to stay here all afternoon discussing these issues. But as we don't, I would like to thank Tina, Joan and Katie so much for your presentations today and for stimulating discussion. And everyone will thank you with their clap reactions. This is our last, as I said at the start, this is our last seminar for the year. I don't know, Bianca, do you want to say anything about plans for next year with the people we still have with us?
Sure. Just very briefly, next year we will be moving to a monthly format for these seminars. They will be on the second Tuesday of every month. And stay tuned as we refine our schedule for who our speakers will be. And hopefully they will be of as high a caliber as the presenters we've had today.
Thanks, Bianca. Thanks everyone for coming. Looking forward to seeing you all in February.
Thank you all.